Good, Rob. How you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, let's jump right in. When we talked the other day, we were talking about how Undertone, where I am, just started accepting advertising in the CBD industry and CBD products last year, and how we've been investigating the legal restrictions around expanding that into the cannabis category. So we're really excited to get your take on things today and how you guys are navigating that marketing and advertising process and the restrictions to succeed in this category. So I guess let's start with the 60,000-foot view. What does the future of cannabis look like?
What does the future look like? Well, I will tell you one thing, which is that as I was listening to the tail end of Adam and Joanna talking just now, I was reflecting on the fact that the level of conversation we have to have about cannabis marketing is like down here, as they're way up here talking about really great global type stuff, and cannabis is not quite there yet. So
yeah, I mean, I think it would be great for you to give a quick overview of the category itself to educate some people.
Yeah, so it's a rapid growth category, right? So 7 years ago, cannabis was well, actually longer ago than that, was voted to be legalized in Colorado. We became the first adult use state in the country in January of 2014, which is exactly when I began as chief marketing officer for my former company, Dixie Brands. So I've been kind of watching it grow from the start to where we are today. And the growth has been immense. When I think about the fact that it's only been 7 years, and I look at where we are today, which is over half the country's population has access to recreational use cannabis, or will, as these various states implement their regulatory environments. And far more than that, 3/4 of the country has access to either medical or recreational. The audience, the addressable audience, has grown exponentially in the course of just 7 years, right? So along with that, there's been an interesting, I'd say, development as it relates to what does the infrastructure look like from a marketing perspective, what do regulations look like on a state-by-state basis, and what does the consumer look like, and how do we overcome the stigmas that Adam referred to earlier in terms of cannabis usage, who is the cannabis consumer. And I think the good news is that much like other social challenges in our country, younger audiences are looking at it and saying, it's just cannabis, right? I enjoy cannabis, or I enjoy alcohol, or I don't enjoy either. But whatever you want to do is fine, right? So that mindset, I think, is really beginning to be reflected in a lot of the public surveys. So I was just reading this morning, I think, every major survey group or survey house that has put surveys into market in the last year, it's been usually at least 2/3 of the country who are in favor of legalization. So it's a pretty dominant majority of the country that is now on board with it. And as a result, we've got a multi-billion-dollar industry that's growing by leaps and bounds year over year. But with that comes a lot of confusion, a lot of anxiety, also a lot of trial and error, certainly on the marketing front.
Yeah. So when you talk about that and all the different states that have come in, and now almost half the country, how do those initiatives evolve from when you first got involved 7 years ago till now? And how are you balancing? There's federal laws and there's local laws and state laws. How do you guys do that from a marketing perspective with all the different things you have to take into consideration?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, and generally, unfortunately, what you end up doing is you end up playing to the lowest common denominator, and by that I mean whatever state has the most stringent regulations is really ultimately what you have to play towards, because in order for you to find any sort of scalability across multiple states, which many brands, Wana included, are now in, so we're in 11 states plus Canada, to create a custom program for each of the 11 states is probably not a realistic goal. So we tend to go towards that lowest common denominator, which means that we have access to some digital platforms. We have to play by the rules that Instagram and Facebook have created for anything social media related. We have access to out of home in some markets, and in those cases, we rely on third parties really to ensure that we're meeting whatever the regulatory standards are for a given market for something like out of home, and same for digital as well. So there's been a wealth of third party companies that have cropped up that have access to regulation all the way down to because it will vary by county and local city levels as well. So even within a state, you have variability across the state itself. But there are these third parties that are really helping to ensure that any of the tactics we put in market will meet those regulations. But as a result, it forces us to really look inwards to the stores. So the stores have become a really strong focal point. And then whatever our owned assets are, so our web presence is, and our ability to affect and drive visibility and sales through our digital platforms.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you mentioned social. I think that's one of, social for every other category. That's the low hanging fruit. That's the easiest way to activate, from a channel standpoint. And with you guys, there comes a little bit more regulation there. So since that's not as much of an option, out of all those things that you mentioned, is there a platform or a channel that you guys have found the most success with, or have seen, have been the most beneficial from making sure that your message is getting in front of the right people?
Yeah. So the good and the bad of this, what I'm about to tell you, is that it is a great way to reach the consumer, but the bad is that it takes it a little bit out of our hands. And by that I mean it's the bud tender. It's in store. So the bud tender really is, and for those who don't know, bud tender is the term used for the person in a dispensary who's making recommendations on products. That bud tender is infused with a lot of power, right? Because I like to say about 80% of the decision making process is influenced by the bud tender. Someone walks into a store, particularly a new consumer or an inexperienced consumer, and they see a wall of products and different, indica, sativa, hybrid, concentrates, edibles, and it's just overwhelming. So the natural question is, well, what do you recommend?
Right.
Well, okay, well, what are you looking for? And you go through a process of elimination. Bud tender says, oh, this is the product you want. Well, if that bud tender doesn't like your brand or your product, much like any retail environment, they're not going to recommend it. But more so in this environment, there are very strong go-to brands, and becoming one of those go-tos for the dispensary is a matter of making sure that we recognize the bud tender as that conduit. So meaning that there are incentives and spiffs and ways that we're saying to the bud tender, hey, we really appreciate what you do for us too. And more importantly, from our perspective, is education. So we spend a tremendous amount of our resources on education platforms that have been custom developed for the cannabis industry to help educate the bud tenders and really give them the tools and the power to be able to educate the consumer about our brands and our products. And we see, not anecdotal, sorry, we see quantitative data that really demonstrates a lift in sales on an individual bud tender level when they've had the training, when they understand the products from the inside out. But that in-store is really where we capture a majority of eyeballs. The customer's already there. The bud tender is helping to make the influence in the sale. So that's been obviously a big part of our marketing budget historically.
That's great. Any history or little tidbit of info you can give on where bud tender came from? That's the first time I've heard that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sometimes I just say things now that like I don't even think about it, right? Bud tender is just what we call them. I think it probably originally came from the idea of like a bartender. Kind of they are, but bud is the flower that they sell. So flower being the plant, the smokable version of the product. Yeah. And they're always looking at buds. That's kind of how you look at nicely formed buds as the flower that you want to purchase.
It's like the sommelier of the cannabis industry.
Kind of, but early on, what happened is that, and this was actually a disservice to the edibles industry, and this is the downside, as I mentioned earlier, about not always having the control over that last touch point to the consumer, is that early on, bud tenders, before they were fully educated, they didn't have the knowledge base to know that if Rob walks in and he's never tried cannabis before, recommending what you like to consume as an avid consumer probably isn't going to do Rob a whole lot of good. And so we had, situations of edibles in particular that were recommended at, too high of a level, too strong. And that leads to some bad experiences. But I think it's gotten much better since then.
Oh, that's good. So, on the Undertone side, we recently started working with a company called Philo, which is considered the largest provider of compliant cannabis and CBD purchase data. So, what we were wondering a little bit is how important is data when it comes to your advertising campaigns, and is there a particular kind of data or type of data that you guys find the most valuable?
Well, for the first, I would say 3 years of this industry's life, there was a dearth of data. I mean, there was no data anywhere. You couldn't get data. Right now, 7 years into it, we have a lot of good point of sale data. So we look at that data directionally, from a product in market, brands, margin standpoint, to see who's doing what in the market. And then on the consumer side, what we're still lacking really is really strong consumer insights. Who is using the product? How are they using it? When are they using it? And we've fielded some surveys, some custom surveys with a couple of different companies, and that's helpful. But it's not ongoing and broad data sets the way that you have in other industries, because we still are not really connecting that point of sale data, the consumer, and the research companies together, because oftentimes the cannabis consumer is still it's a very private transaction. I don't necessarily want to give my data. I don't necessarily want to have someone knowing that I'm purchasing cannabis, right? So there is still a little bit of that stigma. But when it comes to targeting from a digital standpoint, you mentioned Philo, for example, that compliance level that they offer is tremendous. And it harkens back to an acquisition they made of Cannaregs about a year or two ago. Great company that kind of took the entire landscape of all the regulatory frameworks and then put it all in one single updated database, and they were able to lay that over all of their display buying capabilities. And I think that really added a level of value for companies looking to be safe and compliant in what they were doing. On the consumer side, what I've seen most effective, and this really works well for dispensaries, not as much for brands like Wana, is matching digital IDs, right? So then I know I've served up an ad to a known cannabis consumer. I'm actually able to track when they are in the store because I've geofenced the store. So I'm able to match digital IDs, and I'm able to carve out audiences that are cannabis consumers, and I can target them when they are intending to purchase, but also I can track and make sure they got into store. Now, we're still missing the last mile. I haven't seen a really good platform that allows me to connect that consumer in the store purchasing my product, but that's a result of the disparate POSs that all of the stores have. There's no standardized, one or two standardized POS backbones for all the stores.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you talk about the legal restrictions on some of this stuff, and one thing we look at everything on the Undertone side of things really through the lens of creative, and how does that creative evoke an emotional response from the consumer. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the legal restrictions but trying to be creative in the messaging that you have out there as well?
That's a great question, Rob. And I think I always approach it as a CMO from the standpoint of let's think as creatively and aggressively as we possibly can, and then we'll dial it back, right? I mean, same thing I would say about budgets, right? I don't want to do creative in terms of, well, what's my budget? I want to do creative in terms of what's the best thing we can do, and then we'll figure out if we can make it work for the budget, right? Same thing for regulation. I like to focus on the creative first and then worry about the regulation. The good news is that by and large, companies like Wana and others like us are pretty responsible players, right? So our goal is not to appeal to the most prurient or salacious interests of consumers. It's really to express the brand. Like for us, for example, our tagline being "Enhance Your Life." We really try to fulfill on that tagline with our creative. So we are looking at ways to communicate the fact that we are vegan and gluten-free, ways to communicate the fact that we are consistent and we have quality, right? So those are all creative executions that allow me to be creative. So with the vegan campaign, we did a big campaign with like a cow kind of face, and it was all about how gelatin gummies are made with animal bones, and vegan or pectin gummies are not. So none of that runs afoul creatively of any of the regulatory. What runs afoul of regulatory is either A, speaking to an audience that we can't demonstrate is over 70% over the age of 21, B, anything that would be appealing to children. So no cartoon characters, things of that nature. And then C is being, I guess, for us, it's easy because this is true to our brand, but for other brands, not being really in your face about consumption, right? It's not images of people with, bongs and joints and, a huge party. It's more about the products and the benefits they can provide. So all of those things creatively don't really inhibit us. It's really just making sure that when we put it into market, we're using vehicles and platforms that are going to meet those regulatory requirements.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I love being able to find good ways to creatively get your product's value props out there. I think that's awesome.
Well, although I'm sorry, real quickly, Rob, I'm sorry, I'm going to add something that's
Yeah, yeah.
interesting. So because it does vary by market, there are some challenges sometimes that you wouldn't expect. So for example, in Canada, Health Canada is the one that regulates the products up there. So we have, our product does really well in Canada, but we aren't able to say certain things like vegan and gluten free because they don't want, as I understand it, they don't want to promote anything that may sound like it is a health product.
Right.
They view those as health claims. So then it does become challenging to actually communicate the benefits of your product, even inside of that regulatory environment. In Las Vegas, we had an issue with fruits on our packaging when I was at Dixie because we couldn't display fruit on the packaging. Anyway, so there are those challenges too.
Yeah, and that's a good segue because I was going to say, as more states are legalizing cannabis every day, New York a couple of weeks ago, how do you guys, from a product standpoint and a product sales and even brand presence standpoint, what do you guys do? Like, what's your strategy when a new state comes on board? Do you guys go, full bore right in that state? Is there a method to the madness?
Oh, there's definitely a method to the madness. A lot of it depends upon the regulatory framework of a given state. So there are what are called limited license states. There are unlimited license states. Oklahoma would be an example of an unlimited license state. And as a result, you end up with 1,000 dispensaries, 500 different brands. I mean, it's pretty much a kind of a free for all. And that creates one set of challenges and opportunities. And then there's limited market state, there are limited license states like, for example, Missouri or Arkansas. That's a different set of circumstances. And then we look at the population. So if it is a medical only state, what do we believe? And we have enough historical data now to be able to look at a state and say, okay, this is the percentage of the population that is likely to get a medical card, so we can begin to gauge the potential revenue from a given market. But it's also the regulatory environment as it relates to product sets. So for example, in Pennsylvania, in their medical market, edibles aren't allowed. So we would have to put our pills or our tinctures into that market, not our flagship product, which is our gummies. All of those things really play into which markets are most beneficial to us. New York is a really interesting example because as a medical market, New York was not a great market. It was limited license, but severely limited, and the number of conditions allowable were so small that you didn't have a huge database of potential patients. In addition to that, you had a very thriving black market, right? So people in New York have been buying cannabis the same way for years, right? Dozens of years. So to overcome that with a medical market, a very limited medical market, just from a business standpoint, wasn't super appealing. Now, as a recreational market, different story, right? So it changes the nature of how we look at New York.
No, that's great. So there's actually a couple of questions in the chat. So I want to make sure we get to them because I know that the Brand Innovators folks want to make sure that we stay on time. So we got about 10 minutes or so left. Isabel in the audience, her question was, what is your process in opening businesses in newly legalized states? And does it start with the marketing team?
Well, no, actually it starts with our out-of-state team. So identifying a partner. So we can't go into every market as Wana and have a license in those markets. In some cases we could, but we choose not to. So in every market other than Colorado currently, we have everything from either a straight licensing agreement up to more of a contract manufacturing agreement in each of those markets. So finding that right partner is the job of our sort of advanced team, right? So who can we partner with the market that has the financial wherewithal, the facility, the expertise that we culturally are a good fit with, because that's a very big part of our brand is our culture and making sure that they respect the community, they respect their employees. There's a lot of those pieces that we look at when we try and identify a partner, but that's the first thing, identify the partner. Next thing is then begin to understand operationally how to take our product set and operationalize it in that market, given the regulatory environment. The last step is once we've done all that, we've done all the training, we've got the facility up and running, we've ensured that they know how to make the product, then we worry about launching the product into market, and we will worry about distribution and marketing in that market.
Great. The next question that came in is, and I'll add a little bit to this because we actually didn't talk about this yet, so this will be interesting for everyone to hear. who is your key consumer? You know, what's the demographic, what's the age? And then the question actually that came in is, how do you envision your consumer demographic changing and expanding as this category explodes over the next couple of years?
Great question. So as I mentioned earlier, there's still a pretty much a dearth of true consumer data. But we know enough to know, like for Wana, for example, we skew a little female. We skew a little bit older than the average consumer. So the largest segment is going to be like 21 to 32, I think. And then there's kind of a lull in the middle. And then the fastest growing segment is actually 55 plus from a growth standpoint. So our consumer tends to be a little bit higher household income because our products are premium and priced as such. And we tend to attract, I think, a consumer who is focused on quality and value. I mean, that's harder to say, to pin that down demographically. But you know, why I say everyone is our consumer is because we are at such a nascent stage in this industry. So in any given community, I think the data would show that about 15% of that population has consumed cannabis in the last month in a legal market currently. When you look at that as compared to alcohol, where I think the numbers are closer to like 80% have consumed alcohol in the last month, there's a huge gap, right, in terms of the addressable audience that we eventually will reach once the industry continues to grow and we remove some of the stigma, we stabilize around regulation. And I think as more and more people try these products that are directed towards new consumers and that are a little bit easier to understand, more use case specific, we're going to grow that 15% much larger. At that point, in terms of that future consumer, I think we're looking at, you know, business professionals. I think we're looking at pretty much anyone who decides that it's better to have less calories and no hangover and have cannabis as a part of their life.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think you know, one of the things we were talking a little bit about yesterday is just the different types of solutions that are out there. And you mentioned, you know, some companies will come to you and the plenty of outreaches that you get on a daily basis saying that they can do something and they might not necessarily be able to do what they're saying they can do, especially in this category. So what advice would you have for vendors who are out there, you know, even in Undertone, who are looking to expand their capabilities in the cannabis space? What are the things from a CMO's perspective that you want to make sure that they're coming to you with?
Well, there's two parts of my answer. One is, Rob, is the relationship side of it. We're definitely a relationship-based industry. And so when I was mentioning earlier, or yesterday rather, about all the inquiries I get, most of them are cold calls or cold emails, right? So those are the ones where, and I think this is probably true across industries, it's not just cannabis, but it just so happens that a lot of people have targeted cannabis as a new growth industry. So we do get a tremendous amount of outreach. And for me, not knowing who these people are or being able to differentiate the value proposition from one platform to the next, it doesn't compel me to want to get in touch with them, right? So going through from a relationship perspective is critically important. I think understanding the industry from the inside out and being able to identify the pain points, not just tell me you're going to increase my revenue, not just tell me that you can help to automate my marketing, but really understand what that means to someone like me, because I mentioned also yesterday that we are still so nascent that the infrastructure, the ability to leverage a really complex, let's say automated marketing system, most cannabis companies don't have that capability. They just don't have the resources internally, and they don't have the need for it because of the size and scope of what we do. So that's why I say understanding who we are and where we are as an industry, I think is another really important piece, because those are the ones I dismiss out of hand. I'm like, I don't have time to listen to your pitch about your, you know, multi-continent platform that can do X, Y, and Z for me, because I can't even some days, you know, find time to tie my shoes. So,
right.
You know, let's focus on what my real needs are, and they're smaller in scope than everybody wants to think they are.
So how did you guys adapt and adjust last March when everything shut down on us from a pandemic perspective? How did the strategy at Wana change overnight, I'm sure?
Yeah, well, first, a quick funny anecdote, which is here in Colorado, in Denver, when the pandemic, you know, when they first said, okay, we're gonna have to lock down and go into quarantine, the mayor went on TV and announced the quarantines and everything. He said, and we're shutting down dispensaries and liquor stores, you would have thought he said we were like, I mean, people just went completely bananas, and the lines within minutes at the dispensaries were like down the street and everything. Now, of course, he came back on three hours later and said, I misspoke. I made a mistake. Dispensaries are actually essential businesses, and they will stay open. And that was actually, even though I'm making a joke about it, it was actually a huge step. And then almost every other state other than Massachusetts followed that same path and said that cannabis businesses were essential. Huge watershed moment for us as an industry to be recognized as an essential business. And as a result, we saw sales really spike during that period where we thought dispensaries were going to be closed. They then came down a little bit, but then throughout the pandemic, they continued to climb. So we were the beneficiaries of not only that designation, but also the fact that I think people found some level of solace for their anxiety and for other ailments during the quarantine that really benefited us. But as a brand, we also knew that consumers weren't going to dispensaries, right? And so in California, you have a robust delivery system. In Colorado and other markets, we don't have delivery access. So we had to begin to understand how to reach that consumer without them going into the dispensary. So we implemented a few things, luckily, ahead of time. My former marketing director, she brought on board a company called iHeartJane. They do a lot of the back end of the e-commerce for a lot of the dispensaries. We were able to implement what I'll call an e-commerce light version on our website, so people can actually go through the Wana site and reserve a product at a dispensary through our website. That was a great way for us to really try to close that gap between someone looking at a product and actually being able to reserve that product directly on our platform. So we shifted a lot of our attention to digital. We shifted a lot of our attention to reaching that consumer with education before they made their decision. So we had to reimagine the customer journey as it related to a cannabis product, because that bud tender may no longer be in the middle. The other benefit, though, is that we also saw all of the hard work we'd done over the past 10 years of generating a product that people felt loyalty towards. Because what happened in the pandemic was people said, you know what? I don't know what the latest and greatest product is. I love Wana. I'm gonna use that product. That's the product I'm gonna go back to. And so we saw a lot of really strong repeat business as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how, I've been so impressed over this past year how companies have adapted and adjusted and been able to find the sweet spot, which is good to hear. That's great. So I think we have time.
Just quick.
Yeah,
sorry, real quickly, just kudos to the rest of the company on the Wana side, because we were all locked down as well. I've not been in the office from the first day I started at Wana, which was the week that the lockdown occurred. But my point is that our operations team, our out-of-state team, we launched multiple new markets. We did all the training remotely. We got them online and on board. I mean, what the Wana team did during this pandemic was pretty amazing. And our compounded annual growth rate was somewhere in the range of like 38% year over year.
Wow, that is that's phenomenal. So speaking of Wana, let's talk about the brand for a minute. A question that came in is, what are some new products that Wana has either recently launched or will be launching soon in 2021?
Well, I'm excited to say that we have a lot of really cool new products in the pipeline, products that are going to be different than anything we've ever done, but I can't tell you what they are. Well, what I can tell you is
we'll all have to wait for the release of them.
Our greatest innovation of the last year, and this also was launched right as the pandemic was starting, was our Wana Quick line. So I know we're running out of time here, but real quickly, we understood, and it's not too hard to understand this, but for most people, edibles are challenging. The onset time can be variable up to an hour and a half. The offset time can be variable as well, up to 6 to 8 hours sometimes. Not everyone wants to strap in for that kind of a journey, right? So, so we identified a technology. It took us several years to do it, that allowed us to offer a product that is fast acting. So it activates for most people in about 15 minutes. So you begin to feel the effects of it. It also has a defined off ramp after 2 to 3 hours. So you're not, there for the next 8 hours, worried about your cat or whatever. And we were able to offer what is called we call it a smoker's high, but really quick science. When you smoke, it's a Delta 9 THC product. When you eat it, your liver converts it to 11-hydroxy, which is what creates a different experience for edibles and why people sometimes don't have a great experience with edibles is because it's much more impactful, kind of a version of THC. This product encapsulates the THC molecule, so it doesn't actually get digested. It actually goes directly into the bloodstream, so it remains Delta 9, which means it's a completely different edible experience. Taking off like crazy. All three SKUs we launched here in Colorado were in the top 10 of Colorado. We just launched them in Canada. We're launching them in 3 additional markets. In fact, California just launched a week ago. That is our big lead product right now, and people absolutely love that product.
Wow, that's great. Very cool. So I know we're pretty close to time. David hasn't jumped on yet. So maybe in closing, is there anything that about the industry itself, about Wana, about cannabis that you want to share before we get cut off?
Sure. Oh, there's David right there, right on time. But I'll add this, which is, cannabis is new, right, for the industry and for consumers, and there's still a lot to learn. Most of the really great players in the industry, and I put Wana in that category, their desire is to bring a safe product that people can enjoy and that can benefit people's lives. And so it's just going to take some education and some time, and we have to undo a lot of the damage that's been done by the war on drugs. That's a big part of our focus as Wana as well, in terms of our CSR activities. And so have time, have patience, and if you've not experienced it, in a legal state, I suggest try it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, thanks so much, Joe. I appreciate it. I think I'm sure everyone in the audience appreciates the education on the category, and I think that there's just so much info out there. Go out and read about it, and just see the tremendous growth that's happening here, because it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I appreciate you having me as well. Dave, we can't hear you.
It's always once a day, if not more. No, it's really fascinating, and the way that you guys are navigating, again, this nascent but exploding industry on the product innovation and the science of it as well, while you're also navigating the laws that are changed from state to state. It's really impressive. I mean, like, just in the last couple of months, New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, lots of new territories as these laws change. So it'll be really great to see what you guys continue to cook up. And how you grow. So thank you, Joe, so much for joining us and sharing with our community. Rob, fantastic job leading this discussion. We're thrilled to have you both, and hopefully we'll have you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to continue for everybody out there on Zoom and on YouTube. We're going to keep this show rolling. We've heard from speakers now in the CBD and cannabis